Susan Norman is the InterVarsity Faculty Fellowship Director, and she's coming to us from the Vancouver Galiano Islands, and she's going to introduce our speaker and moderate. Susan?
Thanks, Peter. I'm really happy to introduce Cindy to you. She is an amazing woman, and I'm very glad she's joined us. She's the library director at Regent College, which is an amazing job, and assistant professor of the history of Christianity at Regent in Vancouver. So even though books and written word is important to Cindy, her research actually took her into the realm of spirituality and friendship. And she studied both theology and history, and her PhD is from Oxford University. Her research there focused on the spiritual lives and manuscript culture of 18th century British women. Very interesting and very focused group. Thank you. Thank you again for joining us today. And so let us know what some of the things you've learned about friendship in the Academy.
Yes. Thank you, Susan. It's a very kind introduction. Shall I share my screen here? I managed to test it out. I think I should be able to do it. There we go. Thanks so much, Susan. Organizing a few things on my screen. That's what we all have to do. So I'm going to be talking with you today about friendship and the intellectual life, both past and present, which is a topic that, as Susan said, interests me greatly. And I'll be sharing with you some of my research into those, the manuscript cultures of those 18th century British women that Susan mentioned. And I look forward to doing that. But what I'm going to start with is actually this slide here. So this is a painting by the Italian Baroque master Caravaggio, and it portrays Narcissus, whose story was first told by the classical poet Ovid in book 3 of his Metamorphoses. Narcissus, a handsome young man, scorns the love of others and the company of all but himself. One day, as he walks through a grove of trees, he comes upon a clear pool with silvery bright water. Ovid describes the scene like this. He looks with speechless wonder at himself and hangs there motionless in the same expression, like a statue carved from Parian marble. He gazes at his eyes, twin stars, and his locks, on his smooth cheeks, his ivory neck, the glorious beauty of his face. Unwittingly, he desires himself and burns with love. Stretched on the shaded grass, he gazes at that false image with eyes that cannot look their fill. Unable to draw himself away from himself, Narcissus weakens, and as hoarfrost melts before the warm morning sun, so does he, wasted with love, pine away, and is slowly consumed by its hidden fire. He tries to kiss and embrace the image, and is despondent when the image shatters and fades and his arms are left empty. In his madness, for this is where his self-love has driven him, Narcissus drooped his weary head on the green grass, and death sealed the eyes that marveled at their master's beauty. Now, this might seem an odd way to begin our time together today, since the theme of your conference this weekend is friendship, which is a much happier subject, surely. But the flip side of companionship and connection is isolation. And Caravaggio's depiction of Narcissus beautifully illuminates the problem of isolation. Here, Narcissus gazes at himself and no other, The painting has an arresting circular composition. Here, Narcissus leans forward, bracing himself with his right arm as he peers into the pool. His look is intense, and his golden locks fall onto his forehead. Light falls obliquely from the left, casting a shadow on his neck and highlighting his knee and garment sleeve. The sleeve casts a silvery reflection into the pool. Self gazes on self. Narcissus falls in love with his own reflected self-image. This is a self-regarding loop where no one can enter. It is a closed circle with room and regard for only one. We all have a little Narcissus in us. Some of us more, some less. And there are different reasons for our narcissism, which of course is the name of the personality trait derived from the mythic Narcissus. Often the word is used to describe people who have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for extensive attention and admiration, and a lack of empathy for others. You might also use words like self-centered and arrogant to describe such people. These are the lovers of self, identified by Paul in 2 Timothy. But there are subtler ways to think about narcissism, and I'd like to reflect with you for a few moments on where we might recognize Narcissus in its isolationist, self-regarding loop in our own lives, even if we do not have a full-blown case of narcissistic personality disorder. More than that, I'd like to think with you about why we should strive to break down isolating, self-regarding tendencies and lift our eyes to see another, to look into the eyes of a friend. Now, as I was preparing this talk, it occurred to me that COVID-19, with its forced isolation, has left many of us all a little more prone to self-regard over the past 19 months, 20 months now, I think. At a most basic level, there is the new and literal self-gaze that is inherent to Zoom. In all my life, I don't think I've looked at myself as much as I have since COVID interrupted all of our lives. I'm looking at myself even now. And I don't know about you, but I find this exhausting. And at a deeper level, there have been such long stretches of deep and difficult isolation, haven't there? The very circumstances of quarantine and lockdown have probably made us all a little more self-occupied. As I've spent time with Caravaggio's Narcissus, I recognized my own COVID-isolated self in the main character. Living alone in my Vancouver apartment, not completely alone, I have my cat within arm's reach right now, but she doesn't speak back to me. Living alone in my little Vancouver apartment, weeks and months went by with no other to look at or talk to there. And my thoughts sometimes seemed to circle round and round and round, a closed circle, uninterrupted by the voices of others. Those of us who live our lives in the academy have unique challenges regarding isolation and the lure of that self-regarding loop. We would be wise to wrestle with that for a while. Those engaged in the intellectual life tend to spend a lot of time on their own, don't we? We need to put those long, quiet hours in if we're to be able to master a subject and make our own contributions to it. Perhaps this is a reason that so many academics are introverts, because, I know from my extrovert friends that it can be hard to spend long days in the library. And alongside those quiet library days, we also want to make our contributions, to stand apart from others, to be able to say, I have done this thing that no one else has done. I've made my unique mark on a larger body of knowledge. When I was a new doctoral student in Oxford, my priest at St. Clement's, a little church that I attended there, he listened to me as I said how lonely I found the work. His reply, yes, you will be lonely. It is always lonely at the frontier. Alone, I was stepping forward into new territory. And as exciting as this is for an academic, it can certainly also be isolating. But to live an intellectual life does not have to be only that. I learned this lesson again and painfully just this week when my colleague, friend, and former professor at Regent College, Dr. Don Lewis, died suddenly from a massive heart attack. This was on Tuesday morning. In the strange and sad few days since, we have gathered in small groups and in large ones, remembering Don. I stood with Susan, actually, in the atrium, a small group of us, the day after. Last month, Don celebrated 40 years as a Regent faculty member. Such a long season of service to the church and academy, which incidentally was in no small way influenced by InterVarsity. In the stories we've been sharing at Regent, some common themes are emerging. And one of these is that Don lived a life of friendship. Back in the 18th century, it was said of the great hymn writer Charles Wesley that he was a man made for friendship. And I think the same could be said of Don. Much of this was unseen, unnoticed, but I'm now learning how very many people he befriended in life and how much time he spent keeping up with all of them, even spending his reading weeks flying between cities to visit former students, asking them how life was for them and always praying for them. The outpouring of love for him on Facebook and other platforms has been astounding, truly beautiful. A wonderful tribute to an intellectual life and a life of friendship, interwoven in one good man. So with this in mind, I'd like to dedicate my talk today to the memory of Don Lewis. May he continue to teach us all. Earlier this year, a book came out titled Friendship in the Age of Loneliness, written by Adam Poswalski. Its theme is profoundly relevant to our cultural moment, in which loneliness is endemic and many people seem content with a stripped down version of friendship. Loneliness is a serious issue in Western cultures. Recent research at Harvard University concluded that loneliness is increasingly being considered a hazard to human health comparable to obesity and smoking. In the US, loneliness is labeled an epidemic worthy of a public health intervention, though there hasn't been any major government action yet. In 2018, the UK government appointed a minister for loneliness to help combat the country's chronic loneliness problem. And these findings were made before COVID-19 collided with these significant challenges to spiritual, social, and mental well-being. We suffer from even greater loneliness now. So how do we think about friendship in an age of uncommon loneliness? Perhaps some of you are feeling this loneliness in very particular ways, even now on your screens, scattered across time zones and many miles. I'm here in Vancouver, and it's about 8:30, I think. I've got my first cup of coffee just here at hand. Take a sip. It seems like it's not quite light even just yet. So some of you may be new to your involvement with InterVarsity. You might be asking, am I really seen in this new setting? Some may have left homes and communities that used to order your lives. Where are the solid places now? It can be very disorienting to be stripped of old labels and have new ones applied. I remember how bewildered I felt when I left Vancouver and Regent College to pursue my doctoral degree at the University of Oxford. Suddenly I was an Oxonian, a Lincolnite, my college, a historian, an 18th centuryist, which is a word I had never encountered before. I'm not sure it is actually a word, but that's what I have become apparently. Had I ceased to be what I was before? Are you asking yourself the same question now? Many of us will feel our own loneliness, even while we're gathered this weekend to think about friendship together. In 2012, a 22-year-old student named Marina Keegan wrote an article for the Yale Daily News. In it, she asked, what is the opposite of loneliness? She wrote, we don't have a word for the opposite of loneliness, but if we did, I could say that's what I want in life. It's not quite love and it's not quite community. It's just this feeling that there are people, an abundance of people who are in this together, who are on your team. When the check is paid and you stay at the table, when it's 4 a.m. and no one goes to bed, that night with the guitar, that night we can't remember, the time we did, we went, we saw, we laughed, we felt. It seems to me that belonging might be what Keegan was after, and in a more particular way in friendship. Our belonging to each other as a community, our belonging to another as a friend, is grounded in our belonging to God, who is all love and kindness. How can we mirror God's love and kindness in our relationships? What does a life of chosen and committed friendship look like? What difference might such a life make in our world? Friendship is one of the most vital of human relationships, and yet it is so seldom talked about. There has been such neglect of the subject in cultural, critical, and ecclesial thought, and this has been true for a while. So in the mid-20th century, C.S. Lewis wrote, "To the ancients, friendship seemed the happiest and most fully human of all loves, the crown of life and the school of virtue. The modern world, in comparison, ignores it." In the years since Lewis wrote his little classic, The Four Loves, friendship has continued to suffer. Many now seem content, as I said, with a stripped down version of friendship. How do we make sense of the friendship that exists on Facebook, for example? I think also that there is no denying that in evangelical culture and North American culture more broadly, marriage and the family are seen as primary relationships. And if marriage and family are primary relationships, friendship is generally considered secondary, if considered at all. Sanctification is so often associated with marriage and parenthood. Here is where we learn to sacrifice. Here I begin to understand the love of God. But can friendship sanctify? Yes, I want to answer emphatically. Yes, it can. It is the school of virtue, as C.S. Lewis said. Or to quote the 12th century Cistercian monk, Alred of Rievaulx, friendship is the school of love. In friendship, we can be changed, formed, drawn nearer to Christ as to the other. And as a historian, I like to ask, maybe I have to ask, where have we come from? In the time I have remaining, I like to look back to those ancients noted by Lewis, and then provide a few examples of friendship from my own study of love and belonging in 18th century Britain, to inquire into the ways that friendship interacts with our experience of the intellectual life, and how friendship can be a force for good in the world. We began with Ovid and the mythic Narcissus. Let's return now to that classical period. Classical views of friendship predated Christian friendship. In that classical figures such as Cicero, who wrote the very influential On Friendship, predated Christ. It is important to take a moment to consider the classical period because friendship was such a pervasive topic in classicist work. Note Lewis's words again, "To the ancients, friendship seemed the happiest and most fully human of all loves, the crown of life and the school of virtue." Looking to history can provide helpful perspective to our contemporary understanding of friendship. And this is why I love to study history. History has the ability to trouble our assumptions about what we might think is good or right or obviously Christian, including the ordering of relationships. In this way, history can have a profound impact on how we understand the present and then choose to live in the present. So let's consider Cicero, author of On Friendship. Cicero's writing on friendship was arguably the most influential amongst the classical scholars. There is good reason why Erasmus, the 15th and 16th century Dutch philosopher, and Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, among many others, valued Cicero, and for more reasons than the famous beauty of his prose. The best of his treatises are valuable in content as well as style. And the first among these is on friendship. Cicero was interested in practical results, the actuality, reality, and pragmatics of friendship. And his account of them on friendship is therefore richly human. Even though it draws on Aristotle and other sources, in its breadth of view, it is arguably the best classical discussion extant. It carries the weight of Cicero's experience as a public man in Rome and the plausibility of real historical examples which his contemporary readers knew and could judge. At the end of his public life, Cicero withdrew to the quiet of his country retreat and devoted himself to writing. And in less than 3 years, 46 to 44 BCE, produced an extraordinary list of works, including his best on friendship. It takes great powers to do what Cicero did, which was to understand, arrange, and articulate important ideas well. His was an intellectual life, as well as public. His works are in print more than 2,000 years after their composition, and he has always been admired for the best of what he did. As his Loeb translator William Falconer writes, the arrangement, plan, style, and illustrations are his own. Certainly no other author of ancient or modern times has discussed the subject of friendship with so much completeness and charm as Cicero. On Friendship is filled with heartfelt advice that is honest and moving. Some Romans viewed friendship in mostly practical terms as a relationship between people for mutual advantage. Cicero didn't deny that such friendships are important, but he reached beyond the utilitarian to praise a deeper kind of friendship in which two people find in each other another self who doesn't seek profit or advantage from the other person. Amongst the advice found in On Friendship is the following. There are different kinds of friendship. This is point number one. Cicero made a key distinction between common and quite useful friendships and those rare friends we bind ourselves to on a much deeper level. These special friendships are necessarily rare because they require so much time and investment of ourselves. But these are the friends that deeply change our lives, just as we change theirs. Cicero wrote, I'm inclined to believe that the immortal gods have given nothing better to humanity than friendship. And point two, only good people can be true friends. People of poor moral character can have friends, but they can only be friends of utility for the simple reason that real friendship requires trust, wisdom, and basic goodness. This is what Cicero said. It is actually a contentious point in some of the scholarship. Number three, we can choose our friends with care, or we should choose our friends with care. We have to be deliberate about forming our friendships, if for no other reason that they can be very messy and painful to end if we find out the friend was not the person we thought. We should take our time, move slowly, and discover what lies deep in a person's heart before we make the investment of self that true friendship requires. Point four, Cicero said, friends make you a better person. No one can thrive in isolation. That's a word for us today, I think. Left on our own, we will stagnate and become unable to see ourselves as we are. A true friend will challenge you to become better because he or she appreciates the potential inside you. Even when a friend is absent, he is present, wrote Cicero. Number five, friends are honest with each other. Friends will always tell you what you need to hear, not what you want them to say. There are plenty of people in the world who will flatter you for their own purposes, but only a real friend or an enemy will risk your anger by telling you the truth. Number six, the reward of friendship is friendship itself. Cicero acknowledged that there are practical advantages to friendship, advice, companionship, support in difficult times. But at its heart, true friendship is not a business relationship. It doesn't seek repayment and it doesn't keep score. We are not so petty as to charge interest on our favors, wrote Cicero, adding, the reward of friendship is friendship itself. And finally, point 7, without friends, life is not worth living. Or as Cicero wrote, suppose a God carried you far away to a place where you were granted an abundance of every material good nature could wish for, every material good that nature could wish for, but denied the possibility of ever seeing a human being. Wouldn't you have to be as hard as iron to endure that sort of life? Wouldn't you, utterly alone, lose every capacity for joy and pleasure? There is so much more that I could say about Cicero's teachings on friendship and how they have been appropriated in the 2 millennia since they were written, but I'll limit myself to that 12th century Cistercian monk I've already mentioned, Aalders of Rievaulx, who wrote his classic Spiritual Friendship as an effort to Christianize Cicero, who, as I mentioned earlier, lived before Christ. Both Cicero and Aalders had high views of friendship and expected much of their friends. And in both the classical and medieval worlds, it was difficult to begin a friendship because it was seen as such an undertaking of great consequence. We should ask ourselves, how does this relate to our own time? The overwhelming and important difference in Aalders' text is the centrality of Christ in friendship relationships. He wrote, here we are, you and I hope that Christ makes a third with us. I think that's beautiful. Or again, on the slide we read, what statement about friendship can be more sublime, more true, more valuable than this? It has been proved that friendship must begin in Christ, continue with Christ, and be perfected in Christ. What could Aalders have meant by this? Simply that Christ is the principle of spiritual friendship. It is according to the life and example of Christ that friendship must be measured. Spiritual friendship must achieve a Christ-like life in friends. When Aalders spoke of spiritual friendship beginning in Christ, continuing in Christ, and being perfected in Christ, what he was talking about is not simply union with Christ, as if that was simple, but a way of life, a special kind of history. To be in Christ is to have our life take discipleship form. Friends can continue in Christ only when they fashion their lives according to Christ, becoming part of the gospel drama in which they try to master the word by being conformed to the word. Recently, The Atlantic published an article titled, "What if friendship, not marriage, was at the center of life?" This might seem a provocative question, but the thing is, the idea that marriage and family are primary relationships, necessarily trumping friendship, is actually quite a modern idea. Back when Christianity was very young, it was Jesus' early followers who upset Roman notions of traditional family ways, choosing to live in allegiance to a different kind of family called the church. Compared to our Christian past, today's friendship is frequently seen as a weak bond. It is often sidelined in our rush to celebrate romantic love. As I said, one of the reasons I love the study of history is its capacity to surprise us. If we allow historical people to speak for themselves, rather than impose on them our modern ways of ordering and understanding the world, we can trouble our assumptions and open ourselves to different ways of living. How will we respond when what we assume is proper Christian praxis was performed differently by past Christians? My own study of love and belonging in 18th century Britain also reveals a far more complex understanding of family and friendship than we typically recognize today. Very often when 18th century English people spoke or wrote about families, it was not the nuclear unit that they had in mind. In recent years, historians have shown that families were often deeply enmeshed into networks of fictive kin. That is, people related to families through contract, acquaintance, friendship, or work, some of whom were co-resident and some more distantly resident. Fictive kinship was at least as important for the meaning of family and kinship as relations of blood, marriage, and law. In that period, there was slippage between terms such as relation, cousin, and friend. Even terms that you'd think were self-evident, like mother or son, had a range of historical meanings. Usages of friendship and kinship terms shaded into each other, blurring, even overturning modern hierarchies of relationship. 18th century relationships were marked by the qualities of inclusiveness and affectionate recognition, which meant that more people were enfolded into systems of care, even households, including those frequently marginalized. Who needs special care in our own world? What boundaries might we need to cross to extend our love to another, to care for another? So let's consider two groups of friends who answered those questions well, and in answering them well became potent conduits of loving kindness in their own time and place. The first group of friends were 18th century British Methodist women who sometimes referred to themselves as the female brethren. It's an awkward term, to be sure, female brethren. But they also refer to themselves as the family, which is the language I've chosen to use here. In 1763, three women of very different backgrounds decided to live together as the family at Leytonstone, a town located within the borders of modern London. Sarah Ryan was the eldest at 39. She was uneducated, brought up in poverty, and at the age of 10 became a domestic servant to help support her family. She also had a controversial past, having, through a complicated series of events, become involved in polygamous and abusive marriage. Sarah Crosby was 34. She seems to have had an easier start in life than Ryan, for Crosby recorded singing, dancing, and playing cards as a child. 6 years before she joined the family, her husband left her after 7 unhappy years. And Mary Bosanquet was the youngest, just 24 at the time. She was born into an affluent Huguenot family, and her early lifestyle included fine clothing and visits to Bath to take the waters, where she danced and enjoyed the social scene. But she gave all of this up and chose a life of simplicity and service after her conversion to Methodism at the age of 16. The family also included a little girl, Brian's orphan niece, Sarah Lawrence, who would in time be adopted by Mary Bosanquet. Kinship and friendship bonds were beautifully interwoven in the family. They lived together in a house called the Cedars, where they planned to live like the first Christians. They wanted to live like the first Christians. Their expressed intention involved lodging strangers, bringing up children, you can read this on this slide, relieving the afflicted, and diligently following after every good work. That's what they came together to do. Came together in friendship to do. They felt called by God to dedicate their lives together to ministry and charitable work, and in particular to care for destitute women and children who had little means to care for themselves. Eventually, the three friends established a school and orphanage at the Cedars, modeled on John Wesley's more famous Kingswood School. Wesley was the founder of Methodism. Within 5 years, they accepted in total 35 children and 34 women, many of whom were very ill when they arrived. The work was hard. Most of the children came to them dirty, without clothes, sick, and with little formal education. Bosanquet planned and led worship. She administered the finances, taught the children, conducted weekly children's meetings, and nursed the sick. She invited sick women into the Cedars to be treated by her. Crosby and Bosanquet instituted nightly Bible readings and prayer. And in time, the orphanage became a Methodist society, which Bosanquet supervised. Crowds began to come to the Cedars for Methodist services. The work was sometimes dangerous. On one occasion, when Bosanquet was speaking to a large company in the kitchen, the doorbell rang loudly and 4 large men with sticks burst in, while outside a mob gathered. The women's radical way of life, their Methodist faith, were an affront to the so-called polite society of 18th century Britain. And just how mobs, sticks, and politeness come together is actually a really interesting question. But I'm just going to leave that hanging for now to avoid going off down a history rabbit trail. The work was also costly. Bosanquet confided to her diary her worries about ending up in the poorhouse. With little business experience, she was wary of any involvement in the intricacies of investment. And when she asked for help from another person, the results were disastrous. While Bosanquet brought the property to the women's shared endeavor, where she inherited the house from her grandmother, she recognized that friendship underpinned their shared ministry and charitable work. She is the mainspring, Bosanquet wrote of Ryan. It is true, the light informing the plans was given to me, but had it not been for her resolution and diligence, they would never have been brought into execution. She is truly devoted to God. In Ryan and Bosanquet's friendship, we again see customary patterns of engagement overturned and the blurring of boundaries between kinship and friendship. Sarah Ryan was frequently ill and confined to bed. And when she was, Bosanquet nursed her lovingly and very willingly. In a culture with well-defined societal statuses, it was an extraordinary act for the highborn Bosanquet to attend so tenderly to Ryan, a one-time domestic servant whose marital history was still a source of scandal within Methodism. Ryan was Bosanquet's friend, but Bosanquet also acknowledged, the Lord gave her to me as a mother. Through most of history, women have relied on men for security and sustenance. To be alone was dangerous for a woman. And women without husbands customarily lived in uncertainty with significant struggles. This was certainly the case in 18th century Anglo-American society, though increasingly women began to find creative ways to forge different kinds of lives. In America, pairs of female friends chose to live together in what became known as Boston marriages. While a woman at the time couldn't support herself on her own, by living with friends, she might live an independent, even intellectual life. The British equivalent of such arrangements between women are sometimes referred to by historians as romantic friendships. Marriages between friends, romantic friendship. In such terminology, we see relational categories strained by experience. We see slippage and elision of terms that challenge modern relational hierarchies. What possibilities might this open up? By living together at the Cedars, Bosanquet, Crosby, and Ryan were able to dedicate themselves to lives of compassion and service outside the home, as it were. They also mutually supported each other in their work, which was especially necessary given the unusualness of women having active lives of ministry. John Wesley certainly supported them, but they needed the friendship of each other as well. In fact, when a group of English Methodist women wanted to describe their sense of unity and spiritual purpose, they called themselves the Female Brethren. And as much as Ryan, Crosby, and Bosanquet identified as the family, they also identified as female brethren, as I mentioned. This moniker illustrates the difference in status between brotherhood and sisterhood. Within Anglo-American society more generally, the idea of sisterhood was not as pervasive as brethren or brotherhood. The plural of a religious sister and the correlate to brethren, sistren or sistren, was rarely used after the 16th century with the dissolution of the monasteries. As well, within the Methodist family, the Methodist brothers had the fraternity of preachers to reinforce their brotherly identities. Sisters had no official designation, and a group of sisters had no readily available official identity. So throughout the 18th century, the most prominent of Methodist female leaders and preachers banded together and called themselves the Female Brethren. It was oxymoronic, perhaps, but the term was meant to denote the fellowship and unity of the group, together with the seriousness of their Christian work together. If the family at Leytonstone had been asked, who are the widows in your world? What borders do you need to cross to extend your love to another, to care for another? How would they have answered? I think they would have answered that the widows in their world were poor children and women. In a culture and social structure that prevented women and children from being able to fully care for themselves, not that children ever can, these populations were often vulnerable to the decisions and whims of men. Sarah Ryan knew this well. She was sent into service at the age of 10 because her father squandered money on alcohol and left the family destitute. The family saw that poor women and children needed special care. They needed a place to go when their world shattered. Bosanquet, Ryan, and Crosby lived countercultural lives in crossing class borders to live together in friendship, to raise their eyes from themselves to see another, to live like the first Christians, and to live lives of ministry and service to others, again crossing borders. They were a powerful conduit of love and kindness in their own time and place. In 1766, John Wesley wrote, I rode over to Leytonstone and found one truly Christian family. And when the female brethren died, they were, fittingly, buried together. As a second example, let's consider Anne and Mary Steele. Sisters, as well as friends, and in addition, devout 18th century Baptists. And let's think about how they used letters to support each other emotionally and spiritually. They lived together until 1749, when Mary, then 25 years old, married Joseph Wakeford and left the family home to move 10 miles away, a distance far enough to significantly alter the way in which they interacted. Steele was 32 and remained at home, caring for their aging parents. Within a few months of her marriage, Wakeford began to regret not her marriage, but the lack of religious conversation in her new situation. And she wrote to Steele proposing a correspondence in which some little part of our time be spent in freely writing our serious thoughts to each other. She hoped that such a correspondence would provide spiritual stimulation and support no longer available to her in person. Steele accepted her sister's suggestion with pleasure, and thus began their deliberately supportive and spiritual correspondence. Steele described the goal of their correspondence. You and I, my dear Mary, let us endeavor to encourage each other in the journey by talking of the glorious person who has wrought such wonders of surprising love. By 1752, Steele and Wakeford had developed the pattern of their literary conversation. One or the other would suggest a topic, and they would each enlarge on it, turn by turn, letter by letter, occasionally incorporating verse, for both were poets as well. Steele wished that she and her sister could more often converse with each other in person, but she accepted this as impractical and cheered herself, writing, "It is, however, in my power to talk a little on paper, but what shall be the subject?" Their correspondence was self-consciously an extension of the kind of conversation they engaged in when together. In 1752, Steele wrote, "Sometimes I have borrowed useful hints from conversation and endeavored to improve them in my thoughts to some valuable purpose," and explained that the reflection she wrote to Wakeford were in fact the product of a friendly chat since you have been here. Steele and Wakeford used this purposeful letter writing format to work out their Calvinistic piety in creative ways. In 1757, Steele took as her subject for a letter the resemblance of the human heart to a garden. The theme emerged from her own immediate surroundings. She had just walked through her brother's garden and recalled the care that had been taken in weeding it to prepare for the visit of some friends. Conveying a Calvinistic absorption with human sinfulness, Steele now reflected on the noxious, worthless weeds that choked her own heart. She wrote, "Many weeds rise, perhaps unnoticed, some with feeble effort I attempt to pull up, and sometimes think I have succeeded, but soon find myself mistaken. They spring again and convince me that the root was left behind." While Methodists in the period actively strove to overcome sin, believing that entire sanctification was possible on earth, Calvinistic Baptists believe sin to be a pervasive and persistent aspect of earthly existence, overcome only in death. Developing her garden analogy, Steele turned to God, the diligent gardener, to root out weeds and so cleanse her from sin, concluding that her own laboring for salvation would be in vain if not for God's sovereign grace. Steele's correspondence with her sister provided a place to imaginatively rehearse those Baptist beliefs and spiritual ideals. And she concluded her letter asking, "Let me have your thoughts in return." In her reply, Wakeford recast Steele's reflection in terms of her own surroundings, the more domestic scene of a chaotic house. But her conclusion was consistent. How difficult, how impossible rather, is it for a person to cleanse and rectify the least defilement, the smallest disorder of the heart. Yet more than rehearsing Baptist theology as they had inherited it, and as they continued to hear it preached in churches, or Baptist chapels, as they would have been called, their friendship and correspondence enabled Steele and Wakeford to probe theological ideas, experimenting with images and vocabulary, and testing the implications of these ideas for their spiritual lives. In this way, Steele and Wakeford learned to use Calvinistic language in new and nuanced ways. On the one hand, Steele articulated a conventional Calvinistic understanding of sin and salvation by assuming a passive role in response to God's divine agency. That is, God as gardener removed sin, weeds from her heart, the soil. On the other hand, Steele sometimes cast herself in the role not of soil, but of gardener. As gardener, she actively labored to root out choking weeds by personal effort. In this analysis, God supplied the conditions by which she worked: seasonable showers and cheering sunshine, or the winter of adversity. These might affect her labors, but the task of weeding out sin remained hers. In her correspondence with Wakeford, she engaged in an extended theological meditation on the reflection between divine and human agency in salvation and sanctification. Steele and Wakeford's correspondence enabled an ongoing intellectual reflection on their shared faith. But it also provided very personal encouragement for Wakeford when she was lonely and felt unsupported. By 1757, Wakeford had been married for 8 years and had 2 young sons, aged 4 and 5. She found her domestic situation difficult, and she continued to feel the geographical distance from her friends and family at home. "Methinks I am an alien in a strange land," she wrote. She missed the emotional and psychological support of those who knew and loved her well, but also felt a painful lack of spiritual support. She wrote to Steele, "I have had no one but our children to talk with, and how insipid and tiresome is empty tittle-tattle for several days together. One afternoon I was at Mrs. Bria, but though with the aged there should be wisdom, it does not always appear to be so. In short, the sense of my want of a friend here capable and willing to converse with me on sensible and serious subjects has occasioned in me many gloomy thoughts of late. I often think of the psalmist's words, 'Refuge failed me, no man cared for my soul.' There is no one here who has so much friendship for me as to seek to do my soul good by religious conversation." In response, Steele offered encouragement in the kind of religious conversation that Wakeford lacked in her new home, where her conflicted maternal experience demonstrates an alternative to the stereotyped and sentimental representations of motherhood that have led some historians to identify an increasingly powerful cult of maternity from the early 18th century. While Wakeford was exasperated by what she called the children's perversenesses and grew weary of their childish prattle, the older women in the neighborhood disappointed her desire for spiritual guidance. And older women in the neighborhood disappointed her desire for spiritual guidance. Corresponding with her sister, supplied her need for a spiritual friend and intellectual conversation partner. Steele was pleased to be such a friend to her sister, but in her reply, she delicately inquired about her husband, Joseph Wakeford. May I venture to write my mind? Why do I ask it? She wrote. I wish for his sake, as well as yours, there could be more freedom and frequency in religious conversation. She encouraged Wakeford to try to talk seriously with her husband. Well-timed, repeated efforts might produce that freedom and frequency of religious converse, which I suppose each of you think profitable and pleasing. Steele invested religious conversation with comparable spiritual significance to more public means of grace, such as prayer, meditation, and attending public worship. She argued that it was her and her sister's duty to use the appointed means to encourage each other's faith and that of their dearest relatives through spiritual dialogue. Steele and Wakeford's correspondence always took place within the context of their family. Her mother was aware of it and may have been responding with maternal concern for Wakeford's domestic situation when she wrote in her diary some days later that she was pleased with the spiritual conversation by letter between our daughters. As Steele and Wakeford's correspondence demonstrates, the experience of domesticity and motherhood could inform the practice of friendship in complex ways. The demands of caring for home and family interfered with Wakeford's efforts to play her part in their correspondence. She wrote in 1757, I have every day tried to study up something for a letter, but in vain, and concluded, dinner is coming, my work all neglected, though it wants to be done against washing. 4 months later again, she complained, I have scarce ever opportunity. Either I cannot be alone long enough or other employments demand my attention. There are innumerable things from without to hinder my writing and reading. She grew worried at her inability to engage in the correspondence as she would like, for she believed in its capacity to stimulate her thought and sustain her spiritual life. The fewer helps I have, the less I am put in mind of religious things, she wrote. In response to Wakeford's frustrations, Steele acknowledged, I am sensible, you have less leisure than I, and then offered some practical advice. Will you permit me to advise a little? She wrote. Whenever a thought of importance passes through your mind, arrest it, recall it, think it over again, and consider what improvement may be made of it. Write it. This will strengthen the impression. It sounds like advice I give my students at Regent. Write it. Lay it by till your next leisure or thinking season. Read it over, and perhaps new reflections may arise on the subject. This will, I believe, after a few trials, will be easy and afford entertainment and profit to yourself as well as to me. Begun with advice, Steele's letter concluded with very personal, affectionate encouragement. Since Wakeford could not think of what to write and felt spiritually discouraged, Steele proposed a topic she hoped would bolster her sister's flagging spirits. The free, unmerited, unbounded mercy of God and the infinite merits of our great mediator. Let this be our theme. This is the theme of angels and glorified saints, the song of eternal bliss. Oh, let us, imploring the powerful influences of the Blessed Comforter, endeavor to mediate on this all-important, this ever-interesting subject till we find our hearts warmed to love and praise. Steele and Wakeford's friendship was formed under the same roof and by the same inherited faith. It took new shape when Wakeford married and moved away. An event that initiated an intentional spiritual correspondence that challenged and sustained the sisters in very different circumstances. Steele as a single woman caring for aging parents, and Wakeford as a young wife and mother. Steele and Wakeford designed an epistolary, a letter writing strategy of mutual meditation on a religious theme that enabled them to reflect on and rehearse Baptist theology together and to come to apprehend it in more personal and nuanced ways. Yet while their letters were serious and sometimes abstracted, they were always affectionate and personal, encouraging intimacy and spiritual depth. And while Steele sometimes took the lead in their relationship, encouraging her more diffident and discouraged sister, she and Wakeford designed their literary conversation to be mutually beneficial. Steele wrote, "Let us, my sister, my friend, mutually endeavor to quicken and stimulate each other." And what about us here today? I'd like to invite you to think about your friendships. These are such important relationships in all of our lives, but many of us don't give them the time and attention they deserve or indeed need. Think about those people in your life who you call friends, or who you have called friends. And then think about reaching out to one who you'd like to have a deeper friendship with, whatever that might mean for you both. What would it take to move that friendship to a deeper level? Can you prioritize friendship? Begin to engage in it with the sort of seriousness and commitment we've witnessed in Bosanquet, Crosby, and Ryan, or with the intentional spiritual and intellectual interaction of Steele and Wakeford. Can you make the radical choice to cross boundaries with love, to lift your eyes to the eyes of another? William Rawlings, professor of interpersonal communications at Ohio University, provides one possible taxonomy of friendship that may be helpful as you take stock of your relationships, your friendships. By this time in many of our lives, we have likely accumulated many friends from different jobs, different cities, and different activities who don't know one another at all. Rawlings argues that these friends fall into three categories: active, dormant, and commemorative. Friendships are active if you are in touch regularly. You could call on them for emotional support and it wouldn't be weird. If you pretty much know what's going on in their lives at this moment, that is an active friendship. A dormant friendship has history. Maybe you haven't spoken in a while, but you still think of that person as a friend. You'd be happy to hear from them. And if you were in their city, you'd definitely meet up. A commemorative friend is not someone you expect to hear from or see maybe ever again. But they were important to you at an earlier time in your life, and you think of them fondly for that reason and still consider them a friend. Facebook makes things weird by keeping these friends sort of continually in your peripheral vision. Rawlings suggests that Facebook is a kind of trophy case of commemorative friends. The voluntary nature of friendship makes it subject to life's whims in a way some other relationships are not. There can be a timeline to friendship. That's okay. It's natural. But I fear we too easily let friendship slip through our fingers because we aren't paying attention. One of the beautiful, special things about friendship is that friends are friends because they want to be. They choose each other in a way that is not true of kinship relationships. But this can make friendship fragile. What one thing can you do to give tender care to a friendship? And finally, I began by talking about our lives in the academy and how the intellectual life is prone to the experience of loneliness. But it needn't be, and I hope it won't be for you. When I was a doctoral student at the University of Oxford, I was introduced to an old Oxford Don named John Walsh by Bruce Hindmarsh, who had been my master's thesis supervisor at Regent College, and who is now my colleague and friend. If Bruce, as my supervisor, was my academic father, John was my academic grandfather, for he had once guided Bruce in the early stages of his academic life. And Bruce introduced me to John as such. He introduced me as John's academic granddaughter. I love the way terms of connection can be used flexibly to draw people together. John began to keep an eye out for me, coming along to support my paper presentations, inviting me to meals at Jesus College, and much else. At one meal at Jesus College, we talked about the loneliness of the intellectual life, and he said to me, "Find a Friday on your island." Do you know the reference? It is to the novel Robinson Crusoe, which was published by Daniel Defoe in 1717, back to the 18th century. Shipwrecked on an island in the Caribbean, entirely alone for 24 years, Crusoe finally met Friday, who became his companion. John's advice to find a Friday on my island meant simply to find someone who trod the same ground in some way, who could speak the same language and understand the culture of my academic inquiry. It was great advice. And the friends I came to make during those years remain some of my closest and most cherished, even as they have been generative intellectually. May it be so for you also. Thank you.
Cindy, thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you. I hope we have time for a couple of questions, or maybe one or two. You can write it in the chat or just speak up. Cindy, what have you found to be the greatest joy in the kind of friendships you're talking about?
Yes, you know, the opportunity to grow close to somebody who cares about, you know, the same things that I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and to grow close to them in a way that is not only intellectual, right? So that we're having, you know, a cozy scholarly debate, you know, over a pint at a pub or something like that. But to have that, but also just a deep investment in personal lives of another person, the sort of leading together of those kinds of
The whole
ways.
person.
The whole person, absolutely. So, I mean, I could give you examples of some of those friendships in my life. Maybe I'll just share one. A good friend from Oxford. He started a year after I did, and turned up in a graduate seminar that I was attending on the 18th century British history. And at that first meeting, we went around the circle to sort of say, you know, this is what I'm researching. And he used the word evangelical in describing what he was doing. And he said afterwards that he saw my head pop up because I hadn't heard the word in a year because I'd started the year before. And so we chatted, we sort of like went to each other when it was time to have a glass of wine, because you rarely have an event at Oxford that isn't accompanied by a glass of wine. And And he said, where are you from? And I said, this little place, the west coast of Canada called Regent College. He is from New Zealand. And he said, oh, yes. And he pulled out a book that had been published by Bruce Hindmarsh, his latest book at the time. And I just about hugged him, like that kind of connection. And from there, I became goddaughter to his eldest daughter, and am deeply involved in the lives of his entire family. We've gone on vacation together a couple of times, and we also have long conversations about the 18th century. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's wonderful. I see we have a question that could take us through till dinner time, even on the West Coast. Friendship across gender lines
Yes.
seems complicated with issues of sexuality. How
Yeah.
can we be friends across this line? Good
Yeah,
question, Rudy.
that's a
Thanks.
great question. Yeah. I would want to say wisely, as you would be in any relationship. Like I just mentioned, my friend Roshan from New Zealand. I'm friends with his wife and his entire family, but I was friends with Roshan first, and we actually have the deepest connection, deeper than with his wife. Yeah, there are rules that sometimes people will live by, like the Billy Graham rule. I'll never be alone with I think it might even just be a single woman, but maybe it's a woman, on just any woman. I would just encourage people not to make those sort of rules that you live by. It robs you of the opportunity to learn from somebody whose experience is different from yours. And really, we need to be wise in all kinds of ways, certainly sexually. But I also think that, you make a rule like, I'm not going to be alone with a woman if you're a man, to honor your wife or your marriage relationship. But really, men can be attracted to men as well, women to women. So it's not, that's not ensuring any kind of safety. Yeah, and really, I don't know. I would just say, embrace that kind of relationship. Don't rob yourselves unnecessarily.
By the way, Cindy and Dr. Maxine Hancock talk about this more extensively in a podcast that's available. I think it's on the Regent website that you can get access to it. It's wonderful. And they talk about this in very helpful ways. So look for it.
Thanks, Susan.
And another, and by the way, Cindy and Maxine have the kind of friendship that we've been talking about, a wonderful one. Now, our next question has to do with something that I struggle with because I've moved a lot. These relationships from the past that were very rich and good, how do we hold them with the new relationships in our new place?
Yeah. I think that when you move away from somebody, necessarily there is going to be a change in the way that you interact. But I would encourage, people, myself included, to make the effort to continue to be in contact in a deep way, not just like liking people's Facebook posts or something like that. I mean, that's fine. You can like a photo, but create time for those deep and more meaningful conversations. And maybe even like just be aware of time, right? So maybe like think to yourself, let's try to connect once a month, right? I try to do that with my friend Roshan, who has now returned to New Zealand. And it's always a bit complicated because they're a day ahead and 4 hours behind, and it's hard to wrap your mind around that
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I've also had friends who've said, like, I'm maxed out. I can't take on more friendships.
Yeah.
That seems a sadness to me.
Yeah.
Think about Don and his many, many, many friends. Yeah. The time that
Yes.
he gave them.
Yes.
Yeah.
The next question, how to watch out for investing too much or not enough into a friendship?
Mm. Too much. I'm not sure how to like to think about investing
I
too
don't
much
know.
in a friendship.
Yeah. Maybe Chloe, Chloe, would you like to speak about your question? Maybe explain a bit more what you were looking for?
No, okay. Sorry, I couldn't.
There we are.
Okay, now it's okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi,
Okay.
Chloe.
Yeah, hello. Thank you so much for your sharing. It was really thought provoking. What my question was, yeah, what Carol was mentioning in the comments, like an uneven investment. That's it's
Okay.
like I am trying to I want to be friends with you, but I don't know, am I not doing enough so that they did not realize that my intention of being friends, or I'm just doing too much and they just don't want to be like, don't want to
Right.
invest in this relationship.
Yeah. So that sort of encounter might happen early on in a friendship,
Mhm.
maybe when you're just kind of trying to find out where you each stand. I think that there is sort of a naturalness to that, you know, sort of negotiation of a new relationship. Um, but I think that we should feel free to talk about things like that. So I have a pair of friends who they have been best friends for about 30 years. And when they first met each other, one of them said, this was very early on after they'd met. She said, I can see us being friends for life. And the other friend was a bit like taken aback because nobody had been that forthright with, you know, their desire to know her before. But, you know, they talked about it and they're friends 30 years on, and deeply, like, deep friends. You know, it's good to talk about those sorts of things in any relationship, and we should feel free to do that with our friends as well. Treat the relationship as a serious relationship. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Maybe one more question. Time's running out.
Peter has his hand up.
Okay, Peter?
I think this is a question for a historian. In our little conference already, we've done, I'm going to call it deconstruction of the academy, where, you know, career and competition seem to form the structures and take them down. We talked with Danny Zacharias this morning about Western ways of knowing, Western ways of doing, and how they need to be deconstructed in order to make room for friendships with the people we have treaties with. And then your presentation today talking about deconstructing, I think, marriage, family, nuclear family, and opening up to other configurations, blurring boundaries. Does friendship itself, as we understand it in the West, need some deconstructing too? Or is it something that needs upbuilding because it's been neglected, as you said?
I think it needs a serious rebuilding. It has been, it's been neglected. And really, and that has been a recent thing. Really, in the 20th century, 21st century, has friendship really begun to seem like, you know, it's a bit of fun. It's you know, it's good to have friends, but what you really need in life is a spouse and children, and family is, you know, the important relationship. I'm not saying that those are not important relationships, but I think that we need to elevate friendship as a vital relationship in everybody's lives, whether you're married or not married, whether you have children or not, or you don't have children. Again, to learn from people who have a different experience from us as well. We do have, when we think about friendships as it's a bit of fun, there can be a tendency to look for people who look the same as you. It's easier to be friends with people who have the same experience as you, but your life can be so much more deeply enriched by crossing borders, gender borders, racial borders, cultural borders, all of those things. This has been one of the gifts to me in terms of my time at Regent College, which has such an international group of scholars and students, be able to learn from people who are different. Mm-hmm.
I think our time is up. Sorry, James, that was a good question. We should talk about that sometime, you and I. James is a colleague with InterVarsity.
Yeah.